Time last year, Rishi Sunak might have felt like putting his feet up after losing the Tory leadership to Liz Truss. But just weeks later, he had his nose to the grindstone, moving into number 10 to placate the markets and try to calm down the public. He's here now, and as John was saying, we're delighted to have you here for a live interview. So let's find out what kind of Prime Minister you really want to be. You've come out as a big supporter of drivers, talking about the war on motorists. Now, we've had a look at some of the people who are fighting what you call that war. One of them is in Cornwall, where the council is proposing a speed limit of 20 miles an hour, the kind you say is anti-British. But they're a Conservative council. Are they fighting a war against motorists?
Well, good morning, Laura. Fantastic to be with you. And when it comes to this point around driving, you know, what occurred to me as I was going around the country talking to people, that there just seemed to be this sense that lots of people wanted to stop making life easy for people to use their cars. And I don't think that was right. Cars, for most people, are the form of transport that they rely on the most. It's a freedom that it gives you. It's the ability to just get around and do your day-to-day life. And for too many people, it felt like everyone was trying to stop them doing that, imposing on them blanket speed restrictions. That's what we've seen in Wales from the Labour government there, blanket 20 mile an hour.
We've had a close look at what's happening in Wales, and it's very similar to what this Conservative council in Cornwall is proposing. And also even in your own part of the world, in North Yorkshire, there are, I think, more than 100 parish councils who want to have a 20 mile an hour limit. So if you think it's the wrong thing, as you've explained, will you stop Conservative councils bringing in these plans?
Yeah, this is about local people being in the driving seat, and it's about making sure that things are not imposed on local communities without their consent. Now, of course, it makes sense to have speed limits around, for example, school areas. Everyone wants safety for our children, but these things need to be done with consent, and it can't be part of this war on motorists. And that's why, for example, when I was Chancellor, I cut fuel duty by record amounts to help people with the cost of living, because, again, cars are important. It's why we've seen, actually, again, you were talking about ULEZ earlier, this idea that ordinary families should be forced to pay £12.50 just to take their kids to school, to do the weekly shop. You know, all of these things don't strike me as being right for our country. And it's right that we reset the balance here and respect and recognise that people do rely on their cars.
But I'd like to be really clear about what you're actually proposing here. So our viewers will have heard you express sympathy for people who think driving's pretty tough these days. But I want to be really clear about what you're actually proposing. Will you stop councils, whether they're Conservative, Labour or any colour of the rainbow, will you stop them introducing 20 mile an hour zones as a default? Because that's really what's at stake here. You can complain about it, as lots of our viewers might do, but are you going to stop it happening? Because if you don't, then it's just rhetoric, isn't it?
No, what this is about is making sure that the statutory guidance that goes to local councils from government is clear about making sure that councils, which are obviously in charge of what's happening in their local areas, are doing things with the support and consent of their local communities,
but if they
taking into account the needs of their communities,
but if they have
and not imposing things on them without their consent.
But if they have that, they can crack on.
What I don't want to do is, obviously, the Transport Secretary is going to set out the detail of this in his speech later on.
But hang on, you've been talking about this for the last few days.
Yes,
you're trying to make a big pitch on this. I want to be really clear. What you've just said is if local councils who are democratically elected, if they want to do it, they should be allowed to do it.
Yeah, what they should be allowed to do in all cases is act in accordance with the government guidance. And that's what we're going to bring forward, is making sure that the guidance to councils about how these things are done is done with regard to the needs and wants of local communities. And what we've seen in Labour-run Wales, a blanket imposition of a 20 mile an hour speed limit.
What you're
and what you've seen are hundreds of thousands of people have risen up against that and signed a petition. And that gives you a sense of the strength of feeling on this issue. And I want people to know that we are on their side.
But what you have said is if local communities and local councils who are democratically elected want to do it, they can do it. And that is an important point, because I think some of this in the last few days, people might think, you know, your love for motorists seems to have come to you in the Conservative Party quite recently. You know, it was a Conservative government that told cities all over the country to bring in clean air zones, which was tough for the drivers of older vehicles. It was a Conservative mayor who first introduced and announced the low emission zone in London. Conservative councils have been introducing 20 mile an hour zones. And, you know, a sceptic might just wonder if your newfound passion for this agenda comes from the fact that you've been in the doldrums in the polls for a long time, and yet you hung on in Uxbridge, in the London suburb, by campaigning against the low emission zone that your party put forward as a plan. That's what's happening here, isn't it?
I guess the bit that you failed to mention, Laura, that when I was Chancellor, I cut fuel duty by a record amount. So
as previous Chancellors did before you,
I cut
with
it, but
long-running
what
campaigns.
previous Chancellors did was freeze fuel duty. What I did was cut it by the largest amount, pretty much on record. That saves drivers £100 a year over the past year. I did that a long time ago. And you talked about ULEZ. Now, all I'd say is, when it came to charting a new course on net zero, which I set out the other day, I set out a way to get there more pragmatic, more proportionate, more realistic, and that will save families £5, 10, 15, £20,000.
Well, those figures are a bit disputed about who will save how much just when.
If I could just finish the point.
Of course.
Now, I charted out that new course on net zero. That wasn't some knee-jerk reaction to the Uxbridge by-election. I, for a long time, have had concerns about the costs that were being asked of working families when it came to meeting these net zero targets. And I came to the view that we could meet what are world-leading targets, by the way, because we're doing more than anyone else, but we could do it in a more pragmatic and realistic way that saves people costs, not unnecessarily having to switch their cars, replace their boilers, particularly in rural areas. That's what I did. Look, I get that there'll be criticism of that decision. I'm fine with it because I think it's the right long-term decision for our country.
But that's interesting, because you say you had these concerns about the costs that the net zero targets were imposing for a long time. Now, you were at the cabinet table busily supporting Boris Johnson's net zero targets. Is it the case that you disagreed with him privately and you were raising these concerns? Or have you only just realised how serious the costs might potentially have been? Which is it?
I've raised these concerns in the past, but I've been Prime Minister for less than a year, and now I'm the one responsible for it.
But so when you were Chancellor, you were unhappy about the targets?
Of course, I raised concerns at the time about the costs that were going to be put on families. And one of the points I made the other week is, when we debate these things in Parliament, what I'd like to see next time around, when we set a carbon budget in Parliament that says this is how we're going to reduce carbon emissions, at the same time, the country should also be considering all the things that are required to meet that budget. That seems to me to be the sensible way to do this. What I don't like is the way that we've done this in the past, because it's not being honest with people. That's not the kind of leadership that I want to bring. I want to do things differently, because if we want to change our country, we have to approach politics differently. And this is an example of it.
But
it's me being upfront about what's required, saying that these are the costs that were being put on people. I don't agree with them. I think we can still get there without them. I'm confident of that. We're not walking away from any of our targets,
can you be
which are
honest about
world-leading.
this, though?
And that, I think, is actually a position that will command the broad support of the British people.
But can you be honest about this, though? Is that by slowing down the pace of hitting the net zero target, which you've explained that you wanted to do and you had concerns about some time, pretty much every single environmental expert, including lots of Conservatives who care passionately about this, say the obvious logic here is that you are slowing down the UK's progress to hitting its climate targets, and that is a short-term political calculation because you've had heat from the right in your party about the green agenda. Rightly or wrongly, can you be honest with everybody watching this morning and say, sure, politics is part of it, because you were worried about it being unpopular?
Absolutely not, because I'm focused on doing what I believe is right for the country in the long term. I've had these concerns for a long time. Here are the facts. Let's just go over the facts of what you said. We've already decarbonised faster than any other major G7 economy. That's a fact. We all have a set of targets for how much we're going to decarbonise by 2030. Again, who's the best? We are, down 68%.
It's not really a reason to give up something because you're good at it, is it?
No, hang on. We are going to meet these targets while we're decarbonising faster than everybody else, faster than Europe,
and there are
America,
plenty of
Australia,
analysts,
Canada,
including
Japan.
the independent watchdog on this, says that actually we're likely to be off track.
Laura, if I could just finish, because it's really important. We are not off track. We are not off track. All these other countries are behind us. We're ahead of them. We're going to continue to be ahead of them. We have an obligation to meet these targets. We will meet them. That's what all our analysis says. But we can do so in a more proportionate, pragmatic way that saves families thousands of pounds. Now, for all the critics, which you are right, there are critics of what we're doing. The question for them is, why do they think it's right to impose costs of £5, 10, 15, £20,000 on families to do something that we don't think is necessary to meet world-leading net zero targets? It's fine to criticise me, it's fine to disagree, but then you have to explain to families why you think it's right to impose those costs on them. I don't think it is, and that's why we're charting a new course. And that's an example of doing things differently and doing the right thing for the country in the long term.
Well, let's talk about another long-term decision, and I'm glad you mentioned tracks there, because there's a seamless move on to talk about the railways. We are sitting in Salford, right next to Manchester. Yes or no? Will HS2, high-speed rail, come to this part of the world?
There's already spades in the ground on HS2 and we're getting on with delivering it.
That's not my question. Yes or no, is it coming here?
I'm not going to comment on all this speculation. We've got a project, we've got spades in the ground and we're getting on with it. But it's right to focus on levelling up. Because
Can I just stop you there? You were the Prime Minister of this country. This is not asking you about speculation. You're not a columnist. You're not a backbencher with an axe to grind. You're not someone from the rail industry. You are the Prime Minister of this country. This is your decision. Is this going to happen or not? As
I said, we've got spades in the ground. I'm not going to comment on further speculation, but what I can tell you we are doing is absolutely committed to levelling up across this country. Just today, we've announced a new plan to put a long-term plan, actually, to focus on people in towns. More people live in towns and live in big cities in our country, and they don't get the attention that they deserve. And my view is that we need to focus on the long-term things that will make our towns better places to live, put local people in control, and that's why we're backing them with £1 billion of funding to help 55 towns across the country, to help them level up, better high streets, more security, less homelessness, in making sure that they protect civic assets, and they're going to be given long-term endowment funding, £20 million per town, empowering local people, putting them in charge of those decisions to help support them. That's an example of levelling up in action that this Conservative government is delivering today.
Might be pleased to hear about that this morning. But you say there again you are committed to long-term decisions, and yet you are visibly refusing to make a long-term decision at this stage about HS2. You've even got it branded on your slogan at the conference, long-term decisions for a brighter future, and yet you won't tell people the decision on HS2. And it's not just about your political critics picking you up on this, it's also people in your own party. Businesses are alarmed by your wobbling on this decision. Andy Street, the Mayor of the West Midlands, a Conservative, says the wobbling over HS2 risks making the UK look a laughing stock.
I'd completely reject that. I speak to business leaders all the time. I've just been around the world. I've recently been in Japan, in America, in Europe. We're attracting billions of pounds of investment into this country, creating jobs everywhere. You talk about levelling up. Because of Brexit, we've created free ports in places like Teesside, where there's record investment coming in, supporting the industries of the future.
But I know you care deeply about the views of business.
Because we've left the EU, we can now sign trade deals with the fastest growing parts of the world, like Asia. This is what we're doing. That's what I hear from business leaders around the world. They're excited about the opportunities that investing in Britain offers.
But you know well that there has been concern over changing the goalposts on net zero and on the HS2 wobble on the decision whenever we're going to get it. Changing your mind may be the right thing to do, but it has a cost. I'd just like to play our viewers and play you a clip.
It's become clear to me over recent months that the Conservative Party are drifting out of touch with the needs of business, of the environment, and also the everyday people that my business touches and serves.
Now, that's Richard Walker. I know some of your colleagues will say he's grumpy because he wanted to be a Conservative MP and hasn't found a seat to run in, but he's the boss of Iceland, which is a big, important company in this country. He's hacked off. You've got former Prime Ministers hacked off over your wobble on HS2. You've got a big group of Tory MPs rattling your cage demanding tax cuts. You've even got Michael Gove, your close colleague this morning, saying there should be tax cuts before the general election. With your changes of heart, have you really got your party under control?
So, look, with Richard, as you said, I think he was trying to stand as a Conservative candidate, but he talked about net zero. He talked about making sure that we're prioritising working people. That's the decision I've made.
But my question is the impact of spooking people by changing your mind.
No. I'm sorry. Yes, change may be uncomfortable for people. People may be critical of it, but I believe I'm doing the right thing for the country. I'm not going to shy away from that. If I believe the right thing to do is to chart a new course to net zero that will save ordinary families £5, £10, £15, £20,000, I'm going to do it. And whether it's him, whether it's anyone else who wants to be critical of that decision, I'm okay with that. They should be the ones that explain why they think it is right to put those costs on people. It might be fine for them to afford it. It's not fine for everyone else. I don't think it's right.
And
when it comes to taxes, look, I'm a Conservative. Of course I want to cut taxes. The best tax cut that I can deliver for the British people right now is to halve inflation.
Well,
that was why it was the first of my priorities.
It's a feature in the economy, but I want to ask you about Michael Gove's comments this morning.
I think actually, no, if I could, please, because it's really important, because you just said something that I completely disagree with. Inflation is a tax. You just said it isn't. Inflation is a tax. It's a tax that impacts the poorest people the most. And that is why the best tax cut that I can deliver is to halve inflation.
Well,
and that's why I set it out as the first.
Let's not have
economically, the
debate.
impact that it has on people is to eat into their pockets, it eats into their wallets, it puts up the prices of things, it effectively acts as a tax. And that is why we must bring it down, and that's why we are, and the plans are working.
But my question to you, Prime Minister, this morning is about the impact of the changes that you have been making. And you're explaining that you think they're the right things to do, and you're basically saying, bring it on to your critics. But on the one specific, your close colleague, Michael Gove, this morning has said that you should commit to cutting taxes for working people before the next election. Will you make that commitment?
Now, as I said, the best tax cut that we can give working people is to halve inflation.
So you won't make that commitment right now?
I'm a Conservative. I want to cut taxes. Yeah. But people saw very clearly. You asked me about making changes. Change may be difficult, but I believe the country wants change, and I'm going to do things differently to bring about that change. And you saw that last summer when it came to this question. I said the most important priority we face was to bring inflation down. It's inflation that's putting the prices of things up.
And you've made
inflation that's making people feel poorer. The quicker we bring inflation down, the better it is. And that's why it's the right priority. And we are making good progress. And you can start to see in the last few months, the numbers are coming down. We've got to stick to the plan because I know things are tough and there is work to do.
And you've made that point. Who voted for the programme you're now putting forward?
Well, look, I'm here putting forward a programme that I believe is right for the country. When I got this job, it wasn't the easiest of circumstances, as you alluded to in your opening, and my first priority was bring immediate relief to people, support with the cost of living, which we've done with energy bills, put a plan in place to stop the boats, and I'm pleased that this year, for the first time since the small boats phenomenon arose, that the numbers of people crossing are down by a fifth, so we are making progress. But now what I want to do is show the country how we're going to change things for the better in the long term. And that means doing things differently, making decisions that will make a difference to people's lives, even if I get criticism for them. That's what the net zero decision was about, and that's how I plan to lead.
But it's interesting, because when the public, I think, looks at all of this, sometimes they wonder, you know, this time last year we asked Liz Truss who had voted for her programme, which of course imploded. And the answer then was, I think, around 80,000 Tory party members. You didn't go through a leadership contest. So no one factually voted for the changes that you are now making. And I just wonder if are you relaxed about that?
Yeah, because I'm doing what I believe is right. I did that last summer. I stood up for my principles. I said what I thought was right for the country, and that was that fighting inflation was a priority, and you can't borrow your way out of doing that. I stuck to my guns, and I'm always going to do what I believe is right for the country, and that's what I'm doing now.
But in terms of what the public voted for, so much of the 2019 manifesto that you stood on has just disappeared. You know, you're wobbling on HS2, you've changed the net zero targets, the long-term plan for social care is not happening. Your health secretary admitted to us a few weeks ago the 40 new hospitals aren't all going to be new hospitals after all. You know, your allies are saying now people are going to see the real Rishi Sunak in this second phase. But is the real Rishi Sunak someone who's willing to chuck much of the 2019 manifesto over the side when you've been behind in the polls?
You're saying things that are just not true. Saying we chuck net zero targets, but that's just not true.
No, I said
we're committed to our net zero targets. We haven't shifted them. They remain exactly the same. They're legislated for. How we get there is always a matter of government policy. The targets are the same. It's wrong to suggest that the targets have been changed. They haven't. It's wrong to suggest that they've been watered down. They haven't. They're set in law.
But the dates of how you get there have shifted.
But there are lots. There are over 100 different policies to help us get to net zero. They weren't all in the 2019 manifesto. The government constantly has a programme of figuring out what the right way to get there is. I've charted a different way to get to the same destination. One that will save families £5,000, £10,000, £15,000, I think is right. But you asked your fundamental question.
But yeah, the fundamental question is
look, I'm doing what I believe is right for the long term of our country. I'm prepared to change things. I'm going to do things differently. I'm going to do what I believe is right. I get that people will be critical of that. I'm okay with that. I'm going to be guided by what I believe is right. I believe that what I'm doing is right for the British people, whether it's a new course on net zero, which will save them money, whether it's putting in place legislation that will enable us to stop the boats, because it should be the British people that decide who comes to our country and not criminal gangs. These are the types of decisions that I'm going to put in place because I believe they're right.
And we're hearing loud and clear that you might keep changing things. There might be more to come if you think that's the right thing, even though they're not things that the public voted for at the last election.
Look, I have a good sense of what the British people's priorities are. I'm going to set about delivering for them, and that's the change that I'm going to bring. I do want to change things. I'm absolutely here to change our country for the better. I believe that means you have to do politics differently, and that's what you saw on net zero, that's what you've seen from me before, and that's what you're going to keep seeing from me going forward, because I can lead this country in a different way and ensure that we get our country on a path to a brighter future. That's what this conference is going to be about, and that's what my leadership is about.
And you mentioned there you feel you've got a good sense of where the public's at. Let's look at what the public associates with you and re-ask them. Now, we did this with Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader. We'll do it again with Keir Starmer. We're using what's called a word cloud, asking people what they associate a leader with, and we can show our viewers that with this morning. Now, you can see there, rightly or wrongly, what many people associate with you is your personal wealth. What does that make you think? Does that worry you if people might feel you're out of touch? Or perhaps, you know, you are very wealthy. You could be living on a beach, not working at all. You know, a lot of people might think, well, you've got all this wealth, you could do anything, good on you for being in public service. But what goes through your mind when you see that?
Look, my job is to deliver for people. And that's why we've just been talking a lot about this net zero decision, which I've made.
I think people would really like to know what your response is. We've talked about the net zero target a lot.
But this is a great example of it. You know, that is a decision which was motivated by me wanting to ease the burden on families. And again, I might get lots of criticism from people about that, people who could happily afford to rip out their boiler, install incredibly expensive energy efficiency upgrades in their rural home that's off the gas grid, or change their car sooner than is necessary. It might be fine for them to do all those things. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's necessary. I want to save families that £5, £10, £15, £20,000. That's why I made the decision I did.
Again,
so
I want to remind our viewers that
it.
those figures are disputed, but you clearly feel good about what you're doing.
You keep saying they're disputed. I mean, literally, you can go online. If you live on an off-gas grid property that currently doesn't have an EPC rating that it was legislated to meant to get to, and then go and ask someone, how much does it cost to upgrade the energy efficiency of that home and put in a heat pump in it, you would come back and they'd say £20,000. It's not a made-up figure, that's fact.
I'm not saying they're made up, but the scale of how many families this would actually affect is something
millions.
that is not entirely as has been presented.
That would have been impacted by these things, and that wasn't right.
We're almost out of time. I just wonder, you took over after, you know, such a crazy time in our politics. You've had now nearly a year in the job. You must sometimes think about your predecessors, your former colleagues. Who's the better Prime Minister, Boris Johnson or Liz Truss?
Look, everyone has great strengths and everyone brings something different to the job. I'm not interested in the past, though. I'm interested in the future and what I can bring to the job. And that's what I think the country wants. And what you're going to get from me is someone who does what they believe is right for the long term of the country. I'm not going to take the easy way out. I'm not going to focus on the short term. I'm going to focus on doing what I believe is right in the long term. That's the leadership that I'm going to bring. I spent the first year stabilising things, making progress on bringing inflation down, reducing the number of boat crossings that are coming, and now I'm going to set out a direction for our country that will lead us to a better place, but that involves doing things differently, that involves bringing change, but that's what I want to do. I want to bring the change, and that's what the country wants.
And you're clearly pitching yourself as a change candidate. The person who wants to, and believes he is the change candidate, of course, is Keir Starmer. Now, politics can be brutal, but it's not all rough and tumble, so I want to ask you, is there anything you admire about him? And I'll give it away, we're going to ask him that next week too.
Look, great. I'm not interested in talking about personalities. People can make up their own minds. I'm interested in setting out my vision for the country, and people can make their own judgment. But what I would say is that you've got to take a stand on things. You've got to take a stand on things. Right? I don't expect everyone to agree with me on everything, but people will have a clear idea of what I believe, what I stand for, and the direction in which I want to lead the country. I don't think actually saying nothing, hiding is the right type of leadership. I think that's an abdication of leadership, quite frankly. I'm interested in setting out a clear set of policies, a clear direction of travel based on my values, which I think are the values shared by the British people, and that's how we're going to do things now. Okay. We're going to do things differently, we're going to change how we do politics, and that's how we're going to change our country.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for coming and giving us your time this morning. I know conference is always a very packed week for a party leader, so we're grateful to you for being us this morning. Thank you so much.
There's surgery lined up for one of the residents in the animal park in half an hour here on BBC One Scotland. First, though, the Sunday Show.